Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I see several familiar faces, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Cindy Seton Rogers, and I'm the Academic and Outreach Events Manager at the Ackerman Center here at UT Dallas. And I'd like to welcome all of you for joining us today. Before we jump into the discussion, I do, however, want to go over just a couple of quick items. First of all, please make sure that you're muted and that you stay muted throughout the entire event. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so please go ahead and put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll address as many of those as we can at the end. I will now turn you over to Dr. Niels Romer, who will introduce our speaker tonight. In addition to being the interim dean for the School of Arts and Humanities and the School of Arts, Technology, and Emerging Communication, Dr. Romer is the Stan and Barbara Rabin Distinguished Professor in Holocaust Studies and the director of the Ackerman Center. Dr. Romer?
Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you all for joining us again. This is, I think, our very first virtual event again of the year, and I think we'll have eventually also our in-person events again, but as we've been just talking about it, we are not quite there yet. And here we have an opportunity really to introduce someone to all of you who otherwise wouldn't have necessarily crossed the Atlantic for this very talk. So it's my great pleasure tonight, this afternoon, for us, night for you, right, Gillian? To introduce you. From the UK, Gillian Wells Perry is a co-founder and honorary vice president of the Anne Frank Trust in the UK, the British partner and organization of the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. She served from 1919 until 2016, that is 26 years, just I've done the math for you there, as the trustee's executive director. And during that time, she really built up the Educational Institute with a big staff of 35 who worked in schools, prisons, and communities, and in any other place where they could possibly have to educate and to go also into some of the UK's most challenging regions. She is currently also still an advisor to the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect in the USA, and is talking to us this afternoon about the surprising global legacy of Anne Frank. So I think we're all going to applaud and welcome you and hand over now to you.
Thank you so much, Nat. It's lovely to be with you here from London. Here in London, it's dark already. It's 10 o'clock at night over in Dallas. And so without any further ado, I'm just going to do the technical bit and share the screen with you so you can all see the lovely pictures, and hopefully you are able to see a blue screen, blue background with a lovely picture of Anne Frank on it.
Yes, ma'am.
So everyone hear me, everyone see me, I hope. So my talk to you tonight is going to be in two parts. Of course, you know who Anne Frank was, and that's probably why you're here. But what I'm going to try to do with you this evening is to bring her to life. Rather than the iconic name that's so associated with the diary and Amsterdam, I really want to give you an insight into her family background, where her family came from, who she was, what her childhood was like before she and her family went into hiding. And so many people have said to me, oh, I don't need to come to your talk because I know everything about Anne Frank, I know all about her. And then they come to the talk and they say to me afterwards, I just didn't know that. You've really made her into a real person for me. So I hope I'm going to do that for you tonight, or rather this afternoon. And the last part of my talk, I hope you've got your suitcases packed, because I know you're there in Texas, but I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the world. And I'm going to take you some quite surprising places, and you're going to hear about the impact that learning about Anne Frank has had in some really quite surprising places that perhaps you wouldn't expect. So without any further ado, let's get going on this story. Now, I can't tell you the story of Anne Frank without talking about this man. And this is her father, Otto Frank. And I always say that if it weren't for him, I wouldn't be speaking to you now, because he is the inspirational figure very much in this story. And as the story progresses, you will understand why. So on the left-hand side, we see a picture of Otto as a young man with his two adored daughters, Margot on the left and little Anne on the right. And on the right, there's Otto as an older man. He actually lived to be very elderly. He lived to be 91, and he died in 1980, which was quite remarkable considering he'd survived the privations of Auschwitz. But Otto's background is very interesting because he came from a German Jewish family who had come out, the family had come out of the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto about 100 years before Otto was born in 1889 in Frankfurt. And by the time Otto and his two brothers and sister Leni were born, his father, Michael Frank, was so inducted into Frankfurt society, feeling so secure in that society that he didn't just work in a bank. Otto's father actually owned a bank, a small investment bank called the Michael Frank Bank. And the family were so highly regarded in Frankfurt society that one of the customers of the Michael Frank Bank was none other than Kaiser Wilhelm himself. Now, as a young man, Otto went off to Heidelberg University to study. And there you see him on the left, looking rather dashing. And there he actually met a young American called Nathan Strauss. And that's Nathan Strauss, the picture on the right, looks rather studious. And Nathan invited his new friend Otto to come across to New York in the summer of 1908 and do some work for his family business. Now, Nathan's father owned a rather well-known department store in New York, and you can see the photograph there of, it's none other, of course, than Macy's. Now, I actually took that picture myself when I was on one of my visits to New York before the pandemic, working with the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect. And I particularly chose that entrance to the store. I mean, the other entrances are very modern, but this is the actual entrance to Macy's that young Otto Frank would have walked in with his head held high, with not a care in the world, to do his work experience for Nathan's father. And that very, very doorway. Now, Otto actually loved New York. He fell in love with the city. He loved its brashness. He loved the fact that it was so go ahead, very different from very rigid Frankfurt society that he was used to. And he felt that this was a great opportunity for him. And you know what? He probably would have stayed in America, maybe even become an American citizen, had not in 1909, his father, Michael Frank, died very suddenly. And Otto was recalled back to Frankfurt to help with the family bank, with the business. Now, he wasn't a born banker. It wasn't, you know, some people are natural bankers. Otto wasn't. He was more a successful small businessman, but nonetheless, he felt the family duty to go and help run the bank. So that's what he did. And 5 years later, in 1914, all that changed because, of course, World War I broke out and Otto was called up to fight. And he fought very patriotically for his country, Germany, very valiantly, so much so that by the end of the war, Otto had received the Iron Cross for bravery and had actually been promoted to the rank of lieutenant. None of that helped him 20 years later. Now, by the early 1920s, of course, the bank was suffering from the economic situation in Germany after World War I. But nonetheless, even though the Franks' fortune had disappeared, they were still very highly regarded in German society. And in 1925, he actually met a young woman called Edith Hollander, daughter of an industrialist from Aachen. And they fell in love and they actually married within 2 months. And they had a lovely society wedding in Aachen. And the young couple went off to enjoy a lovely honeymoon in San Remo in Italy. The following year, in 1926, 16th of February, their first daughter, Margot Betty, was born. You see the picture of her as a baby on the left-hand side. Beautiful, dark-haired, dark-eyed little girl. And then 3 years later, on the 12th of June, 1929, their second daughter, Anneliese Marie, arrived. And her name was soon shortened to Anne, pronounced, of course, in the continental way as Anna. Now, this photograph was taken as Anna is sleeping in her cot. She was probably about 3-4 years old. And it's a very poignant photograph because there she is, such an innocent little tot, unaware of what life holds for her. Now, this photograph was taken of Edith and the two young girls on an outing to Frankfurt city centre in March 1933. And Otto is there with his camera, recording. I don't know whether they were out on a shopping trip or gone out to lunch, but you can see Edith trying to smile at the camera, Margot looking quite stoically, and little Anne scowling. Probably her father had asked to take too many photographs that afternoon. However, by the time this lovely family photograph had been taken, their lives as Jews in Germany had changed very dramatically. Because on the 30th of January of that year, Adolf Hitler had been appointed Chancellor, and on the 5th of March, the Nazi Party had won the federal election. All forms of democracy are soon dismantled, and measures against the Jews start to be implemented. Now, as I'm speaking for the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, I don't need to go into the measures that were implemented against the Jews of Germany. However, suffice to say that by the summer of that year, Otto Frank felt that there was no future for his family in Germany, the country where his family had lived so successfully for many generations. But where to go? It was very difficult. It was very difficult to get visas, to get out to America, even with the help of the influential Strauss family, who really tried to help to get the family visas. They couldn't get visas for America. Very difficult to get out of Germany. Now, Otto thought of Amsterdam could be a safe haven for his family, and there were several reasons for this. Firstly, in World War I, the Netherlands had been neutral. And the country had a history of toleration of Jews and other religions. Now, after the expulsion of the Jews of Spain and Portugal, many of the expelled Jews found their way to Amsterdam and helped build the city into the great trading city it became in the 17th century. In the 18th century, the Netherlands, even despite the fact that it was a Protestant country, was welcoming to Catholics, which was very unusual. Now, on a more pragmatic note, Otto knew Amsterdam well because he'd done business in the city. And also his brother-in-law, who lived in Switzerland, worked for a German company called Opekta. And they were looking for someone to open an office in Amsterdam and manage it. Now, Opekta manufactured a commodity called pectin. And I have to tell you that when I give this talk to schools and a younger demographic, and I ask them if they know what pectin is, I get a lot of sort of blank looks and shaking of the head. But when I talk to an older demographic and I ask, do you know what pectin is? I get some vigorous nodding. Because pectin is the natural setting agent for making jams or jellies. Now, picking fruit or buying fruit and bottling it in the summer for the winter was very popular in the Netherlands and throughout Europe during the 1930s. So here was a very saleable product, and Otto saw a real business opportunity. A little later on, he went into business with a friend whose family were butchers, and they expanded the business to importing spices for sausages. And again, sausages were very, very popular in the Netherlands at that time. So Mr. Frank went ahead in the summer, and later that year, he was joined by Edith and Margot. Now, he had found an apartment in a new development, very modern development for its time, called the Mavederplein in the southwest of the city. And they rented the apartment number 37 in the Mavederplein. Possibly what attracted Otto to this development was probably the nearest thing to a New York skyscraper that you can see in the background. And that was a tall building, believe me, for Amsterdam. The development was built around a triangle of grass where the parents could get to meet and also the children would get to play with each other. The statue of Anne wasn't there, of course, at the time. No one knew who Anne was. It was actually erected quite recently by the owner of the local bookstore around the corner. A little bit more about that later. Now, by the end of 1933, Otto and Edith and Margot are all living in Amsterdam. Anne is brought in February 1934 to join them by her grandmother, who she had been staying with. So by February 1934, the family is complete. Now, Anne starts school, first of all, at the kindergarten, the preschool, and then the elementary school, the school round the corner. It was the Montessori school. Montessori schools being a very popular form of education for the German and Austrian Jewish refugees. Particularly for Anne, Edith and Otto liked the combination of formality in the Montessori method and good solid learning, but also creativity and informality, which suited their younger daughter because she was notoriously talkative and chatty and quite disruptive in class sometimes. Now, if you look carefully at this photograph, you can see little Anne right in the center of the picture with a circle around her, and that there she is in the class. Now, believe it or not, that's still a school. And if you visit Amsterdam in the future and you go down to visit that area of the Merwede-plein, you can go and visit the school. It's called the Anne Frank School. Now, the writing on the wall isn't graffiti put there by some unruly youngster, but it's actually put there deliberately because it replicates the writing in Anne's diary, and it's now known as the Anne Frank School. Now, Anne was an outgoing, chatty, sociable girl. She loved her friends. And so there you can see her in these two photographs. The left-hand photo, she's on the right of the photo, and that's her little friend Susanna Lederman in the dark outfit on the left. And in the right-hand photo, there's Anne, you can see on the right, Susanna in the middle, and another friend called Eva on the left. You can recognize it's outside the Merwede-plein. When I talk to younger children, I sort of ask them to look at the toys that the girls are playing with, because they're very similar to some of the toys that the children still play with. For example, my little 3-year-old grandson has recently taken delivery of his first scooter, looking very much like the scooter they would have played with. People have actually asked me, how come there are so many photographs of Anne and Margot growing up? And there's an enormous collection of beautiful photographs. And that's because Otto was a very keen amateur photographer. In the 1920s, he bought himself a Leica, beautiful German camera. And his twin passions actually became photography and taking photographs of his daughters as they were growing up. And people have also asked me, how come we have, how did they survive? How do we still have these photos? Well, what happened before the family went into hiding, Otto sent a big box of photographs to his family in Switzerland, and that's how they survived. And these are all the photographs that inform any books about Anne Frank, the displays in the Anne Frank house, and of course, all the traveling exhibitions. Now, Anne and Margot had a lovely childhood growing up in Amsterdam. In the summer, they would take a train out of Amsterdam and head west to the coast to the resort of Zandvoort, still a very popular resort. And there you see the two girls. And again, another poignant photo. There they are, sort of staring out to the sea. And I often think, are they thinking about their futures? Looking very chic in their beachwear. And there's Anne just about to jump in the sea. In the winter, they would skate on the frozen canals. Margot was actually very sporty. She was a very academic girl, very scholarly, but she was also sporty, and she belonged to a rowing club and a tennis club, and she really enjoyed the social aspects as well. But of course, all that changed after 1940. In the summer, they would actually also go and visit their family in Switzerland. So they would have holidays abroad, and they would all go up in the mountains together and enjoy the wonderful Swiss mountain scenery. Now, on the 12th of June 1939, Anne celebrated her 10th birthday with her friends. Now, of course, this photograph wasn't coloured at the time. I found it on the internet, and I think it really brings these girls to life in their beautiful clothes. You can probably recognise Anne in the bright green dress, second from the left. The little girl on the far left is Jacqueline Van Marzen. She's actually still alive, and she survived, and she still lives in Amsterdam. I've met her several times. You might recognise the little girl on Anne's right in the white, and that is Susanna Lederman from the previous photographs. Now, Susanna wasn't so lucky. Her family were deported to Auschwitz in 1943, and little Susanna was gassed on arrival. The slightly taller girl next is Hannah Pickgossler. She's known as Lies Kusens in Anne's diary, and she's still alive and lives in Jerusalem. And again, she's been to London several times, and I've had the pleasure of meeting her. Now, the 5 girls on the right of the picture are Anne's non-Jewish friends, and Anne had a very wide circle of friends at that time. Interestingly, the very tall girl in the middle of the picture, by the time this photo was taken, her father had already joined the Dutch Nazi Party. Now, just 11 months after that happy photograph was taken, the unthinkable happens. And on the 10th of May 1940, Germany bombs the Dutch port of Rotterdam. Now, after 5 days, the bombing is so intensive that the Dutch capitulate. The city is practically destroyed, and if you visit Rotterdam nowadays, you'll see a very different type of city from Amsterdam, which still has its historic centre at the heart. But Rotterdam is essentially a modern city because it was completely rebuilt after the war, because it was flattened. Now, the Dutch have capitulated. The Dutch government and the Dutch royal family, led by Queen Wilhelmina, have fled to London, and Germany then invades the Netherlands. And it doesn't take long before measures against the Dutch Jewish population, many of whom were German and Austrian refugees, start to be brought in. In 1941, due to the restrictive measures already inflicted on the Jews, Anne and Margot have to leave their schools and attend a Jewish-only school. Mr. Frank has to hand over his business that he'd built up to his non-Jewish employees. Now, fortunately, he had very trustworthy employees in Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, his managers, who took over the business and were running it, with, of course, Mr. Frank keeping a benign eye on the business. Now, writing in her diary the following year in 1942, Anne describes what it was like as the German occupiers brought in measures against the Jewish population. She writes, "After May 1940, good times were few and far between. Our freedom was severely restricted by a series of anti-Jewish decrees. We were required to wear a yellow star, to turn in our bicycles. We were forbidden to ride on trams, forbidden to go to theatres, cinemas, or other forms of entertainment, swimming pools, tennis courts, or other athletic fields. You couldn't do this and you couldn't do that, but life went on." Now, in 1942, the German occupiers announced that they are going to issue call-up notices for young Jews aged between 16 and 40. They will have to report to be sent to work camps in the East in Germany. Now, very few of those young people actually ever returned. Now, this is very dangerous for the Frank family because Margot has actually turned 16 in February 1942. So you can imagine the Franks, who's tried so desperately to get out of Europe. They can't get out of Europe now, of course, it's at war. But what can they do? Because obviously they don't want Margot to be deported. Now, Victor Kugler, one of Mr. Frank's managers, reminds Mr. Frank that in the building of Mr. Frank's warehouse and offices on the Prinsengracht is a street in central Amsterdam. Prinsen meaning princes, gracht meaning canals, the Prince's Canal. In their building, a very old 17th century typical Dutch merchant's building with lots of rooms and lots of corridors, there is a set of rooms at the back and the top, which very few of the staff even know exist and no one uses. Now, if you look at my picture here of central Amsterdam on the Prinsengracht, the building is highlighted in blue. And the set of rooms that Victor Kugler was describing to Mr. Frank are just underneath the roof at the back. So you can see those rooms. So they start preparing a set of rooms at the back of top of the building in case a call-up notice is issued for Margot and they have to go into hiding very suddenly. That's all they can do. So preparing those set of rooms isn't easy as you think, because they have to do this, of course, when the office is closed and all the staff have gone home. And the buildings in Amsterdam are tall and narrow with very steep steps. And if you walk around Amsterdam and you look up, you'll see at the top of every building, there is a hook. And those hooks are used as hoists to hoist up furniture and heavy and large items to upper floors because it's so difficult to get them up the stairs. So they were having to prepare these rooms with furniture and belongings at night, schlepping it all up the stairs. Now, another thing Victor Kugler suggested was, what about building some kind of bookcase that could conceal the door to the hiding place where they were going to be? And one of the staff, Bet Voskill, her father happened to be a carpenter and she was a trusted member of staff. And so he built this bookcase that once the family had gone into hiding would close against the door. And they filled it with sort of files and folders and all sort of office paraphernalia. And so it wouldn't arouse suspicion that there was even a door behind it. And if you visit the Anne Frank house, which I hope you will at some stage, you will enter the secret annex behind that very same bookcase. 12th of June 1942, it happens to be Anne's 13th birthday. And a few days before her birthday, she and her father are walking around the area of the Moveda Plain where they live. And in the window of the local bookstore, remember I mentioned that a bit earlier, Anne happens to spot this, a little fabric-covered red check notebook. Probably what attracted her to it was this, a brass lock, and what 13-year-old girl that wants to write her secret thoughts in a notebook doesn't want a brass lock on it. So she drops a few hints to her dad, like our kids do when they want it's coming up to their birthday and they want the next pair of trainers or the next iPhone or whatever. And sure enough, Mr. Frank goes back, he buys the book, he buys the notebook, and Edith and Otto present it to Anne as one of the gifts on her 13th birthday. And she's absolutely thrilled. She starts writing in it straight away. And she decides that she is going to share her most intimate thoughts with this notebook that's going to become her diary. And within a week, she's actually even given it a name. She calls it Kitty, after a character in one of her favorite novels. And this is going to be her intimate confidant, which is quite surprising because this is a girl who says she has so many girlfriends and even a few boyfriends as well. But, you know, they're sort of superficial friends. This is going to be her true friend. And so she starts writing details about her life, about her school friends. To be honest, she's not very flattering about her school friends. She goes around, she's quite gossipy about every member of her class. And she describes her family and everyday life. 3 weeks after she receives the diary and has started writing, the dreaded happens. It's a Sunday morning, July the 5th. There is a ring at the doorbell, and it's the postman, which is surprising on a Sunday morning. And he is delivering the dreaded call-up notice for Margot. Margot has to report at midnight with a suitcase for deportation to Germany. There's no time to lose. The following morning, a Monday morning, it's pouring with rain, and very early in the morning, the Frank family walk across Amsterdam, and from the Mavederplein into central Amsterdam to the Prinsengracht, go into the offices, up the stairs before even the staff arrive, so no one sees them, and go behind the bookcase, close the door, and they are in hiding. Now, of course, Anne's diary is with her, and she starts writing in her diary and recording every day, virtually every day, what's happening in those rooms. Now, there's a surprise waiting for her, actually, when she gets to her bedroom, which she's going to share with Margot. Mr. Frank has made a collection of her favorite pictures of movie stars. So she can put them on her bedroom wall to remind her of home. And there are movie stars like Greta Garbo and other people and footballers. She had quite an eclectic interest, but she was also particularly interested in the Dutch and British royal families. And about 20 years ago, I was actually taking the Queen's youngest son, the Earl of Wessex, Prince Edward, around the Anne Frank exhibition. There was a photograph of Anne's bedroom. And I said to him, look, this is Anne's bedroom wall. And she loved to put pictures on the wall. Is there anyone you recognize? And he sort of looked and oh, there's my mother. And if you look carefully in the bottom left, there are two little photographs, one above the other. And the top photograph is Princess Elizabeth, and the bottom photograph is her younger sister, Princess Margaret. And so Prince Edward recognized his mother, and it was actually quite amusing. But Anne's diary became such a comfort to her in hiding. And she wrote about how it felt to be isolated from her friends, not being able to go to school, what went on in the secret annex every day, her fears about what was happening on the outside world, and what would happen to them if they were discovered. Now, a week after they went into hiding, they were joined by another family, that of the Van Pels family. I mentioned to you that Otto Frank had a business associate who was a butcher, and this was Herman Van Pels. And he was also a German Jewish refugee, and he, with his wife Auguste and their 16-year-old son Peter, came and joined the Frank family. Now, at first, Peter and Margot formed a little unit because they were the same age. And to be honest, Anne found them very boring and tedious. But later on, Anne and Peter became friendly, a little bit more about that later. In December of that year, it all changed. Margot had to go and stay in the room with her parents, and Anne was forced to share her room with another person in hiding. And that was a local dentist, Fritz Pfeffer. Now, Anne totally resented this. She didn't like him. She took an instant dislike to him. She found him a strict disciplinarian. They fought like cat and dog over the little writing desk in the room because Fritz wanted to write love letters to his fiancée, his non-Jewish fiancée, Charlotte, who was on the outside. And Anne, of course, wanted to keep writing her diary. And they had a lot of sort of differences. Also, by the way, he snored, and that didn't help things either. Anne actually gave him a name in her diary, a pseudonym, which was Albert Dussel, which meant a fool, a buffoon. But in actual fact, Fritz Pfeffer, she gives him a really bad press, but he was actually 45 years old. I mean, she describes him as a very old man. He was very handsome, very athletic man, and he was desperately missing his fiancée and son. So, there they are, all 8 people now in hiding in a very small set of rooms. Now, I mentioned Peter. By early 1944, Anne is already maturing from a child into an adolescent with all that comes with it. And of course, her body is changing, her emotions are changing, and she starts to feel romantic feelings for this boy because she's isolated from all other boys. And these two would go up the ladder to the dusty old attic on the top, right at the top of the building under the roof. And there they would spend hours together talking and discussing things and sharing their most intimate thoughts. And Anne described her feelings that she was falling in love with this boy. She even enjoyed her first, probably and only kiss up in that dusty old attic. By April 1944, her feelings for Peter were waning. She was finding him a little immature, not really at her intellectual level. And to be honest, she had a new passion. Because in April 1944, there was a broadcast from London from the education minister, the Dutch education minister, in exile. Now, the Franks did have a secret radio in the hiding place, and when the staff went home at night, around 8:30, they would tune to the BBC and listen to news of what was happening in the war. And Mr. Bolkenstein, the Dutch education minister, announces that it would be a great idea if Dutch people under occupation could start writing journals and diaries about their situation, which could possibly be published after the war. So there you are, Anne has a new passion. She is going to have her diary published. So she starts editing everything she's written before with a view to publication. Simultaneously, she is continuing to write her diary. And really, through that summer of 1944, her writing is really maturing and she is becoming an adult. She's taking a real responsibility for the war. She describes how the world should be, with people behaving better towards each other. How she battled with the two sides of her personality, one which was very flippant and comical, and the other much deeper, more caring Anne. So at age 15, this girl was moving towards adulthood, and Anne was developing a real moral framework. Now, something that gave her great comfort in hiding was nature, and she readily admits that when she was on the outside world before, she never appreciated nature. She took it for granted. But her only view of nature was literally the top of the chestnut tree that was in the garden outside the building, that she could see the top of it from the window at the top of that dusty old attic. And she could watch the seasons change through the leaves. And she writes, "It's not my imagination. Looking at the sky, the clouds, the moon and the stars really does make me feel calm and hopeful." And she writes a lot about nature in her diary. Now, I can't tell you the story about the 2 years that those 8 people were in hiding without talking about these people. And these were the brave, heroic helpers of the Frank family and the others in hiding. Now, this photograph was taken after the war when Otto went back into the business. There he is in the middle. And on the left at the bottom is Miep, and she's probably the most well-known of the helpers. She is the person who rescued the diary. On the bottom right is young Bet Voskill. I mentioned her earlier. She was a secretary, and she was still a teenager herself. She was about 19, so she was just around the same age as Margot. At the back are those 2 trusted managers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler. And these were the people who were in the know, and they kept that secret every day, for not just for a week or a month, but for over 2 years. Can you imagine the strain on that? Because the consequences for them as helpers of Jews, if they had been caught, would have been terrible. Now, I was very privileged in the 1990s and early 2000s to spend a lot of time with Miep. She died at an incredible age of 100 in 2010. And that's us together in Anne's bedroom in the mid-1990s. And she was an absolutely remarkable woman. And she still felt an incredible guilt at not being able to save the Frank family in the end. And she had risked her life for over 2 years. It was incredible. Now, in March 1996, I think this is probably the most unforgettable night of my life, a documentary film that I had commissioned I had asked the incredible filmmaker John Blair to make a film about Anne Frank to mark the 50th anniversary of her death in 1995. He went away and he did it. He made something quite extraordinary, and it was nominated for an Oscar. And he called me and he said, "Look, this was all your idea. I'd like you to come to the Oscar ceremony in Hollywood." And I said, well, actually, John, I don't think I'm the person you should be taking. I think it should be Miep. And he said, well, she's a very old lady. You know, she's not going to fly from Amsterdam over to Los Angeles. I said, just ask her. Well, it just so happened that Miep had been invited to Los Angeles at that time to speak in a school. And she was going to be in California. But John persevered and did manage to get me a ticket for the Oscar ceremony. And together, John at the back on the right, myself and Miep, I don't know who the other one is probably a film executive, movie executive. We all walked down that red carpet to the Oscar ceremony. And guess what? It won. First British documentary to win the Oscar in 20 years. And you can imagine, John, instead of taking a glamorous movie star up on the stage, he took a white-haired elderly lady. So imagine everyone was looking, who on earth is this? And he said, ladies and gentlemen, in a city of celluloid heroes, please meet a real one. And the whole auditorium just erupted. Everyone was on their feet when they realized standing on the stage was the helper of Anne Frank. So, as I say, it was one of the most memorable nights of my life. And Miep was a remarkable woman, and I do feel very privileged to have spent so much time with her. 6th of June, 1944, D-Day. British, American, and Canadian troops invade France to liberate Europe from the Nazis. Now, Anne is so excited. She's writing in her diary, D-Day, this is the day. Friends are on their way. And she ends that entry by saying, maybe, just maybe, by October, I'll be able to go back to school. And this is the girl who was often in trouble with her teachers for disrupting the class and chatting, but she had been so isolated from school, from like our kids have been over the last 18 months, from school, from friends. She was desperate to get back to school. So you can imagine through that summer, after June the 6th, the hopes were really high in the secret annex that they would soon be liberated. It was not to be. The 4th of August, 1944, was a warm and sunny day in Amsterdam. At 10 o'clock in the morning, someone, and we will never know who, made a call to the Gestapo. There are Jews hiding on the Prinsengracht. At 10:30, a car draws up outside 263 Prinsengracht. A Gestapo officer, accompanied by 2 Dutch policemen, burst into the offices of Opekta, run up the stairs, and burst into the office of Mr. Kleiman and Mr. Kugler, and where Miep is sitting as well. Brandishing pistols, they look around and they spot the bookcase. Open the bookcase. Mr. Kleiman and Mr. Kugler have that they have to do it. They cannot refuse. Up the stairs they go, where they find the 8 terrified Jews. They take them away down to Gestapo headquarters in southern Amsterdam, where all 8 of them are interrogated for 2 days. They are then put on a train to Westerbork, a transit camp in the north of the Netherlands, where they await transportation to Auschwitz. On the 3rd of September, all 8 Jews are deported from the Netherlands to Auschwitz in Poland. Tragically, if they had been arrested perhaps a month later, they wouldn't have been sent to Auschwitz because they were on the very last transport out of the Netherlands to Poland, to Auschwitz. They arrive at Auschwitz on the 6th of September. On the platform at Auschwitz, the men are separated from the women and they never see their families again. In late October, early November, Anne and Margot are separated from their desperate mother, Edith, and they are sent back to the land of their birth, Germany, to Bergen-Belsen camp. Maybe the girls thought that being sent back to Germany, they would have a better chance of survival, leaving the terrors of Auschwitz. But it was not to be. because by the time the two girls got to Bergen-Belsen, the camp was neglected. There was very little food. I have met several Bergen-Belsen survivors who said to me that they don't even remember seeing food. The water was contaminated, and there were waves of the deadly disease of typhus going through the camp. And if you have no nutrition and you are weak, it is very difficult to survive typhus. Sometime in the spring, late winter, early spring of 1945, the two girls, Margot, and then a day or so later, Anne, could not go on anymore. Their little bodies were thrown into a mass pit. Now, of course, there was no gravestone for them at the time. This gravestone was actually put up by their cousin, Buddy Elias, about 6 or 7 years ago. Sadly, he died about 5 years ago. Had those two girls, as they lay dying, believing that they were orphans and nothing to live for, known that their father had already been liberated from Auschwitz on the 27th of January and was already heading back to Amsterdam, it may have given them the will to just carry on another few weeks, because they died just a few weeks before Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the British on April the 15th. Mr. Frank spent 5 months almost traveling across Europe, because remember, Western Europe was still at war, and eventually gets back to Amsterdam. He has nowhere to live because his apartment on the Merwede Plain had been requisitioned when they went into hiding and given to a Nazi sympathizing Dutch family. So he goes to live with Miep and her husband Jan, equally heroic. He was in the Dutch resistance. And he sets about finding news of his daughters. Now, he knew that Edith had died on the 6th of January in Auschwitz. He'd been informed on the journey home by someone who was with her. But he hoped that the two girls could possibly have survived. So he puts an ad in the local newspaper for news of the girls. And eventually, he receives a telegram in July saying that the two girls had died. And with that, Miep goes, when he gets the news, he goes into the front office and says, Miep, the girls are no more. With that, Miep goes to the drawer of her desk and she pulls out Anne's diary. Here you are, Mr. Frank. Here is the testament of your daughter. He's amazed that Miep has managed to rescue the diary. She very bravely broke the lock when the families had been arrested to see if she could salvage anything. Because it was late in the war, the Allies were approaching. The Frank family could come back very soon. But they had taken all the valuables already with them, but they had just emptied Mr. Frank's briefcase on the floor to collect the valuables. And in that briefcase was probably the most valuable thing of all, Anne's diary. And they just left it on the floor. So Miep gathered it up, kept it in her drawer to give back to Anne. Now, Mr. Frank had a moral dilemma, because on the one hand, he knew that Anne's greatest wish was to have her diary published. Remember, she'd been editing it for publication. But on the other hand, she had not spoken very nicely about the adults in hiding who had perished so terribly. So what was he to do? He asks a few friends for advice, and eventually a friend who is a literary critic writes an article for the local newspaper, Hepburn, and they publish an article on the front page, The Voice of a Child, it's called. Everybody must read this diary. And on the strength of that, a publisher comes forward. Oh, there's Mr. Frank, looking for his girls. A publisher comes forward called Contact. It's a small Catholic publisher, and they agree to publish the diary in a small run of 1,500 copies, just to test the water. Because, you know, this is immediate post-war Amsterdam. People wanted to move on, move forward with their lives. They didn't want to look back. Let's see how it goes. So they published 1,500. It's called Het Achterhuis, the back house. And by December of that year, it's in a second edition. By February of the following year, a third edition. And as they say, the rest is history. Now, one of her first entries in the diary, Anne writes, "Writing in a diary is a really strange experience for someone like me, not only because I've never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that later on neither I nor anyone else will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl. Not interested? Well, to date, Anne's diary has sold more than 30 million copies. It's been translated into more than 70 languages. I was walking through Bangkok Airport in Thailand several years ago, and I saw a copy in the Thai language in Bangkok Airport bookshop. Every year there's new dramatic musical interpretations, documentaries, books about Anne. The interest never wanes. And the traveling exhibits about her life have been seen by 9 million people around the world." It was John F. Kennedy who said in 1960, "Of the multitude who throughout history have spoken for human dignity in times of great suffering and loss, none is more compelling than that of Anne Frank." You may recognize the woman in the middle of the picture, very beautiful woman, as Audrey Hepburn. There on the right is Mr. Frank, and on the left is his second wife, Fritzi Frank. Now, in 1953, he married an Auschwitz survivor, Fritzi. She had lost her husband and beloved teenage son, and she had survived Auschwitz with her daughter, Eva. Eva is my co-founder of the Anne Frank Trust, Eva Schloss. Fritzi and Otto had a very successful marriage and devoted the second half of their lives to promoting Anne's diary as a force for good. And in the late 1950s, when there were plans for a movie of the diary, Otto and Fritzi, who lived in Switzerland, went to visit Audrey, who also lived in Switzerland, and asked her, would she play Anne in the forthcoming movie? Now, in 1991, Eva and I actually met with Audrey Hepburn. She was performing in London. She was doing readings from Anne's diary with the London Symphony Orchestra. And Eva said, you know that my father and stepmother really wanted you to play Anne in the film. And Audrey said to Eva, you know why I couldn't do it, don't you, Eva? And Eva said, well, I assume you had filming commitments. And she said, no, she said, it was just too painful for me. She said, it was so much. When I read Anne's diary, it was like my own teenage years, because Audrey, although she wasn't Jewish, of course, she wasn't a Holocaust victim, but she lived in Arnhem in the Netherlands. She was Dutch. And her mother was in the Dutch resistance. She was exact contemporary of Anne. They were both born in 1929. And Audrey was actually working with the Dutch resistance. She was running errands, hiding messages for the resistance in her school shoes. And she did suffer. One of her uncles was actually executed in the street. She hid from the Gestapo for 3 weeks in a cellar. She hardly had anything to eat, and that's why she was always so slim. And it was a most astonishing meeting. And she agreed to become a patron of the Anne Frank Trust, which I was just setting up. I think she thought it was a big organization. It was just myself and a couple of other people at the time. But it was just such a thrill to have Audrey Hepburn as our very first patron. And of course, she didn't play Anne in the movie. It was played by Millie Perkins, but I do think Audrey would have been a wonderful Anne Frank. Now, in the 1950s, a really strange phenomenon starts happening, that teenagers from around the world start writing letters to Mr. Frank. Now, some of you might remember being teenagers in the 50s and 60s, I certainly do, and we weren't treated like young adults. We were still treated like children, and we couldn't really open up and talk to our parents or our teachers like kids do now. But because Mr. Frank had such a benign reputation in Anne's diary, she adored her father, and the way she wrote about him was as a liberal-minded, free-thinking man, always available to listen when she had problems. Now remember, he was a worldly man. He'd worked in New York. young people start writing to Mr. Frank, having read the diary. And do you know, every single letter he received from anywhere in the world, he sat on an old typewriter and typed a response. And a couple of years ago, I was giving a talk in a New York library, and a woman came up to me and she said, "Gillian, I've got something to show you." And she showed me 2 letters that she had received from Otto Frank when she was a teenager in the 1970s and had written to him. And he became like a father figure to teenagers all over the world. Now, by 1960, the area all around the Prinsengracht, remember it was a very old area, started becoming very derelict. And in those days, city councils would knock historic buildings down. They didn't preserve them like they do nowadays. And there were plans to knock the hiding place down. The people were already coming on pilgrimage to look at the building where Anne Frank had hidden. And so Mr. Frank went with a delegation of a few friends to see the mayor of Amsterdam and said, if we can raise some funds, could we preserve the building as a museum? Now, Mr. Frank's vision wasn't a backward-looking memorial. This was going to be an education centre, so that young people could come together from different religions, from different countries, different backgrounds, and break down those barriers of suspicion and mistrust, so that young people wouldn't have to suffer like his own 2 daughters had. And in May 1960, Anne Frank's hiding place became public and became the Anne Frank House. Now, this photograph was taken on the morning of that opening, and there he is, Mr. Frank, up in that dusty old attic where Anne and Peter used to go to be alone. You can only imagine what this man is thinking of. By the mid-1980s, the queues of people, the lines of people to get into the Anne Frank house are building and building. And believe it or not, the first days you had to, when in the 1960s, you'd go and you'd ring the doorbell and wait for someone to let you in. But you can see the lines of people. The lines of people outside the Anne Frank house became a tourist attraction in themselves. This was actually taken much later than the 1980s. But of course, now you don't see those lines of people. Of course, if you visit the Anne Frank house, there's social distancing, so there aren't so many people going through, but also you have to purchase your tickets online. So that's a tip for you. If you and any of your family are planning a visit to the Anne Frank house, you must book your tickets about 6 weeks in advance online, or else you won't get in. One day, one of the historians is looking out the window, looking at the line of people, and has an idea, and he goes to see the director and he says, how about if we create a traveling Anne Frank house and take it to people that can't get to Amsterdam? Director likes the idea, and the Anne Frank exhibition, the first one was called Anne Frank in the World, is created and launched at the Westerkerk, just around the corner from the hiding place. And then in Frankfurt, and then it came to New York, and has been touring the world ever since. Now, I hope your bags are packed, because the last part of my talk, I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the world. And we're going to go to some surprising places. Now, since 1985, the exhibits have been touring, but over the last 10 years or so, things have changed rather dramatically. Rather than big community exhibits held in cathedrals and big city halls, the Anne Frank organizations tend to work in schools, in smaller environments with smaller exhibits. And what we do is we train the teenagers themselves to be the peer educators, peer-to-peer education. So it's teenagers teaching teenagers about the life of another teenager. And it has been hugely successful. Now here, for example, you see a peer educator, a docent, in Kolkata in India. And she's telling her peers the story of Anne Frank. And the kids themselves, according to my colleagues at the Anne Frank House, made the connections. They didn't have to be preached to, but they made the connections between the discrimination that Anne experienced in the middle of the 20th century in Europe and the iniquities of the caste system that still exist in India. Here we are in Japan. Now, there's two peer educators, but Anne's diary has been popular in Japan since 1952. It was one of the very first countries to publish the diary, which of course is ironic because they were on the German side in the war. But they've had a very strange relationship with Anne Frank in Japan over many years. For decades, Anne was a symbol of the suffering of children during war. They related her story to the suffering of children in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is fine, but they never contextualized her story as a victim of the Holocaust. And it's taken many decades for Anne for the Japanese to understand why Anne was persecuted, that she was a Holocaust victim. And the Anne Frank exhibit has had a great part in the Japanese understanding the true context of Anne's story. And in fact, there is now a Holocaust museum in Tokyo. Since 2002, the Anne Frank Trust, my organisation in the UK, have been taking the Anne Frank exhibit into British prisons. And it's been an incredibly successful programme. And we've actually been training the prisoners themselves to be our peer educators. And here you see a young prisoner proudly wearing his Anne Frank exhibition guide T-shirt, which he keeps afterwards. And after 2 weeks in the prison, we have a graduation ceremony where these guys get a certificate, and sometimes it's the only time they've ever had a certificate for anything in their lives. But what we also do is we take Holocaust survivors into prisons to speak to prisoners, and it's had a profound effect on prisoners. Here is Eva Schloss, my co-founder, Otto Frank's stepdaughter and childhood friend of Anne Frank, by the way. Telling her story. She's in a prison called Wormwood Scrubs in West London. They invite her back year after year prior to the pandemic. And, you know, when prisoners see an elderly woman or man stand in front of them, elegantly dressed, and say, you know, I was in prison too, and describe that they were in prison to be killed. And they tell the prisoners to take every opportunity that's afforded to them in prison to study, to take a degree, to learn a new profession. They really take it to heart when they hear it from a Holocaust survivor. And it really has been an incredible program, and it's given prisoners a new sense of perspective about their own grievances against society. And here's another famous prisoner. Here you probably recognize Mr. Mandela. And Mr. Mandela actually read Anne Frank's diary before he went into prison when he was a young lawyer. And when he was on Robben Island for all those years, he started a university of the mind for the young political prisoners to really inspire them that eventually when they would come back, they would go back into society and help build a better society. And one of the books that he brought over, he had smuggled over to the prison, was Anne's diary. And when he came to open the Anne Frank exhibition in Johannesburg in 1994, he told the story about how Anne's diary was read so much by the prisoners that eventually the little paperback edition fell to bits. And the prisoners took it in turns to copy the pages out by hand, by candlelight in their cells at night, so that they could continue to read Anne's diary. And it's an astonishing story. We don't know what happened to that actual edition of the diary, copied by hand, but I think it's one of the most remarkable stories of the place in history of Anne's diary. And actually, the Anne Frank House carried on working in South Africa after the tour of the exhibition in 94, 95, and working in the townships, you know, those shanty towns, those very impoverished shanty towns outside Johannesburg and Cape Town. And here you see a group of peer educators in their school in Orlando West in a township. And one of the boys on the left of the picture, I don't know exactly which one it is, but after he had done his tour of duty as an Anne Frank exhibition educator, he entered a writing competition run by the American Embassy in South Africa. And he described what it had meant to his life to become an Anne Frank educator at that time. And guess what? He won that competition. He was flown over to Washington, D.C. by the American Embassy. and he was treated like a VIP. He came back, he studied, went to university, and he's now a teacher. And he owes that, the change in his life, to becoming an Anne Frank educator. And here we are in Kazakhstan in Central Asia, the land of Genghis Khan. And you think, what on earth would these kids have in common with a little Jewish girl who lived in Western Europe in the middle of the last century? But you can see how engaged they are with the young peer educator when he's telling them the story of what happened to Anne Frank. In the 1990s and early 2000s, before and after the Good Friday Agreement, I did a lot of work in Northern Ireland. And as you may know, there is still a sectarian divide between the Catholic and Protestant communities in those towns. They have very little opportunities to come together. They go to segregated schools, they live in segregated communities. But when we took the Anne Frank exhibition to Northern Ireland, we would always insist that the Catholic schools and the Protestant schools would come together to learn the messages of Anne's story. And one of the proudest moments of my time at the Trust was when a Catholic school and a Protestant school came together to produce a cross-community newspaper called Anne's Legacy. This was taken in Sao Paulo, in a township, in a favela, very poor community school in Brazil. And you can see these young little peer educators, as young as 11 and 12, telling very enthusiastically, the man with the red tie, the history of Europe in the 20th century. And it didn't seem to worry them at all that the man in the red tie just happened to be none other than the Dutch foreign minister, who was he didn't patronize them, he listened very attentively to their history lessons. And that's working in a very multicultural school in London, where young people are learning from Asian backgrounds, from Muslim backgrounds, learning the story of Anne Frank. And my final photo from the tour of the world is in Sri Lanka, Jaffna. Now, Sri Lanka had a very long, brutal 30-year civil war. And one of the very first projects at the end of that war was the Anne Frank exhibition being taken to Jaffna in the north of the island, which had been cut off isolated from the rest of society during the whole length of the war. And here you see young people with their little peer educator from the Tamil and the Lankan, two sides of the conflict, learning Anne's story together. And these kids said that they were going to create their own traveling exhibition, talking about their own experiences in the war, and they would do it together. And just finally, the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect does a lot of work in schools throughout the US. They do wonderful programs. They're based at the University of South Carolina, and they do some incredible work in schools around the US. So if you know anyone that would like, in Texas, that would like to hire an exhibition and a peer education program, once the pandemic rules are over, please contact the Ackerman. So there you are. There's our extraordinary but ordinary young girl, who in some ways extraordinary, a little girl who just wanted to grow up and live her life. But because to her Nazi oppressors, she was considered subhuman, Untermenschen, not worthy of the right to live, she died the most terrible death of starvation and disease in Bergen-Belsen camp. On the 15th of July, 1944, Anne wrote these words. It's utterly impossible for me to build my life on a foundation of chaos, suffering, and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder that one day will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions. And yet when I look up at the sky, I somehow think that everything will change for the better, that this cruelty will end, and peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them. Anne M. Frank. Just 3 weeks after she wrote those words, Anne and her family were betrayed, arrested, and began their terrible journeys to their deaths. but because of thousands of people around the world, educators, human rights activists, most importantly, those young peer educators, Anne's ideals are being realized. Thank you for listening. And just a little quick plug for my book, The Legacy of Anne Frank, which you can get on Amazon, or you can get from the American publisher, which is Casemate. And all the stories I've told you tonight are elaborated on in the book. You don't have to read it from cover to cover. You can just dip in to stories about remarkable people and stories about different countries of the world. It's like a potted history book. It's been called a handbook of hope, and all about the incredible inspiration that Anne has had on young people all over the world. So thank you for listening. It's been a great pleasure to be speaking to you, and I'm open to any questions or comments.
Thank you very much. As I said at the beginning, if anyone wants to put in a question into the chat, we'll be happy to go through as many as we can. Although I do want to be respectful of the fact that it's after 11 p.m. in London right now. So
no, don't worry about me.
Okay.
I can go on till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Well, don't tempt us. We do have one question so far. How far can Meyer Levin's obsession be seen as a reason for catapulting Anne Frank's diary into public cognizance?
That's very interesting. Well, I don't know if his obsession, his personal obsession, did, because what Anne's diary was already in the public forum before that, and that's how he got to hear of it and how the play actually got written, which eventually, of course, was written by Hackett and Goodrich, which was that could be a whole lecture in itself. I don't think it was Meyer Levin's. Meyer Levin wrote a very good play, and there are people that feel that Otto did do him wrong, but Otto had a very, very strong feelings at the time. And remember, at that time, people weren't so interested in other history of other cultures, and they wanted to identify with people that were like themselves, particularly in America. And Otto felt very, very strongly that Meyer Levin's play was too Jewish. It would be great to be performed on Broadway, where there'd be a Jewish audience that would relate to it, but he wanted to see the play out there to the world. Now, the Goodrich and Hackett play has got its flaws, definitely. Again, it was of its time. But I don't think it was Meyer Levin's obsession that catapulted Anne into the public eye. I think it was the diary itself and how the diary was promoted, and how Otto wanted to see the diary promoted, and he wanted it to be something that everybody could relate to, and young people certainly did and still do. It's remarkable that they still do.
Very much so. Another question: weren't there loose pages found in the annex? Yes,
there were loose pages found in the annex. Remember that this little book didn't last very long. Anne was writing vociferous, she was writing virtually every day, and sometimes very long entries. So this didn't last very long. The helpers were bringing exercise books and any paper that they could acquire. So what Miep actually gathered up from the annex was the diary. Also, Anne wrote stories. She wrote fictional stories, beautiful stories. And if you can get a copy of Tales from the Secret Annex and read some of her stories, I mean, they're all incredible. They've all got a sort of moral framework and a strong message. Yes, so there was quite a collection. Miep literally gathered up everything she could find that Anne had written.
There are in the chat several people congratulating you and thanking you for the wonderful presentation. One of them is both a compliment and a question. Do you have an audiobook? You did an incredible job telling the story in an engaging way.
I started doing an audiobook actually of The Legacy of Anne Frank. I started last February 2020. And I was going to a recording studio. Remember that it's a 300-page book. Now, you don't have to read it all at once. But then the pandemic, COVID hit, and I literally had to give up. So I may go back to it if my voice holds out for 300 pages of reading. But I would like to do one. Thank you. Yeah, it would be nice to do one.
Perfect. I'm scrolling through.
I
but
think you can get it on Kindle. You can get a Kindle version, by the way.
Perfect. I don't see any more questions in the chat, just kudos. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you very much for your time. And another comment says, grateful to have heard your outstanding viewpoint on this important story. And then everyone else is echoing, thank you very much for your time. This has been recorded, and I will be putting it out for anyone who missed it. And I'm sure that you don't mind that we share that as widely as
Absolutely.
possible.
And I'm happy to do it anytime. Anybody, any different organizations, communities that wish for me to do it, either via Zoom or hopefully one day in person. I'm always happy to do it.
With luck. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. But good night from London.
Good night. Good night to you, and goodbye to everyone else. Thank you again.